Hi, everybody. He's awesome.
Keep talking. Oh, that's the intro? Okay, that's a great intro. First of all,
a little louder.
I'm actually honored to be here. Natalie asked me to come to talk about a number of issues, activism, politics, a whole bunch of stuff. But I think first and foremost, the issue of race. I had a brief conversation with a few members of Occupy Philly about that issue. And, you know, we're all family and friends here, so I guess I can be quite candid. First of all, let me say this. I'm honored to be here, but I'm like really humble because I don't know much more about this stuff than any of you. And for me to stand here as if I'm some expert in this and lecture to you, I think is presumptuous. I'm simply here not to lecture or to act like some type of scholar or expert. I'm here to kind of facilitate a discussion. I would venture to say that you all probably have more answers than I do, and that's fine. But I just want to start out from the beginning to say that I'm not here to preach. I'm not here to be a lecturer. I'm not here to assume that I know more about any of this stuff than you all do. I'm just here to kind of raise some questions and talk about my own experience in activist movements. And let me start from the beginning because I'm a lawyer, and a lot of times when progressives and revolutionaries hear from lawyers, they assume that it's some conservative person, or if not conservative, certainly this person has kind of bought into the system. He or she thinks that by going to college and going to law school and passing the bar exam and becoming a lawyer and making a whole bunch of money, that you become part of the system. And even if you don't think it's that bad, a lot of folks think that lawyers are naive, that they think that you go into court and you make the best argument and you win. And nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I went to Ohio State University School of Law, and I won't say I was naive, but I kind of thought that the system could be a little fairer than it is. I looked at what Thurgood Marshall did and other great lawyers did, and I said, okay, they were able to go into court and make cogent arguments and win, and justice was done. But then once I got into law school, I got a chance to see that, pardon my language, but it's all bullshit. And I was so disillusioned and I was so turned off that in my second year I said, well, I'm not going to say what I said, but I said, F this, I'm not doing this. It's like the law is like a corrupt card game and everybody's cheating. And the only way you can win this card game is you got to be a cheater yourself. So I said, F this. I didn't say F this, I said the other word. French this or whatever it is. I said something like that. But my point is, I said I'm not going to be a part of this, and I had a law clinics course, and that's when you can go in as a second-year law student and work with the public defender's office as an intern or community legal services. And I'll never forget a professor. By the way, people accuse me of speaking too fast, and I accuse them of listening too slow. So if you can speed up your listening, then we'll be on the same page. So anyway, I said to him, I said, look, I like this idea of working with the public defender's office, community legal services, all that kind of stuff, but it's all bullshit. I mean, you know, we're really not doing anything except making a corrupt system appear to be legitimate. That the system is corrupt, it's evil, it's wicked, but they allow a few people to win a few cases just to make it look good. And this professor, he was a throwback from the 60s, had the ponytail and all that stuff, and he said, okay, Mike, you can drop out of law school, you can grow your afro, you can wear your dashiki, and you can go in the street with signs and raise hell, and you can maybe make some noise. He said, but what if you become a soldier behind enemy lines? What if you cut your hair? What if you cut your beard? What if you put a suit and tie on? What if you take the bar exam? What if you pass the bar exam? And now you're a lawyer on the inside. And if you're really progressive, if you're really enlightened, if you're really conscious, you can do more damage on the inside than you can on the outside. And I began to see that. And I always tell people, and I learned this from one of my first clients not long out of law school, was representing one of the members of the Move family. And she said to me that you don't go to court to get justice. You go to court to expose the injustice. Let me repeat that. You don't go to court to get justice. You go to court to expose the injustice. So a progressive lawyer can go into court, and even when the judge rules against him or her, or the jury rules against him or her, everybody knows that the reality is that the judge is a liar, the jury is a liar. The Rodney King case, you see the cops beat the shit out of Rodney King on videotape, the jury comes back not guilty, and the prosecutors did a good job. They put the evidence on, they showed what was going on. Even better case, and many of you might not be familiar with this, Delbert, Africa, in August of 1978. After the, I don't know why, well, anyway, let me just get to the point. So he comes out, hands raised, in a clear surrender mode. I mean, how do I know this? I wasn't there, but it's the next best thing because I'm looking at the photographs. I'm looking at the videotape. And this man, arms outstretched, no shirt on, hands exposed, fingers exposed, and then you see two cops who just come up to him and just beat him down. If you think the Rodney King beating was vicious, you have to Google Delbert, Africa, and see the video on YouTube. They beat this man so bad, I don't know how he survived. In fact, one boot cop kicked him in his head and face so hard, I actually thought his head was going to be severed from his neck. It was that vicious and that brutal. So you see this, you see these photographs at the trial. You see these videotapes at the trial. And the way the case goes on in a criminal case, you pick the jury, you do the opening statements, and then you put, the prosecution puts on its case. That's called a case in chief. So they picked the jury, the defense did its opening statement, prosecution did its opening statement, the witnesses were called, and the prosecution, believe it or not, did a decent case of simply showing the videotape to the jury. So after the case was put on, what's supposed to happen now is, now the defense attorney puts its case on and brings in its witnesses. But before doing that, the judge said, I'm going to grant a motion for judgment of acquittal. What that means is this. The judge said the case against the cops who are on photographs and videotapes, the case against the cops was so weak, it would be a travesty of justice to give the case to the jury for them to decide. Because they could decide the wrong thing, and there's nothing for this jury to decide. These cops are clearly innocent of everything. So before the defense even puts his case on, the judge took the case from the jury and acquitted the cops and found them not guilty. And I'm looking at that and saying, you know, how could that be? And as outraged, I mean, I really didn't know too much about the law then, but looking back on it, as outraged as I was about that, there was some good in that, believe it or not. And the good in that goes back to what my client said about you don't go to court to get justice, you go to court to expose the injustice. So any kid who would follow behind me and go into law school wouldn't be as naive as I was going into law school, because they could say, I saw that Delbert Africa tape. I saw the cops beat the slop out of him, and I saw the judge say it didn't happen. So the good thing about that travesty of justice is that it slaps people in the face to the point where they realize that there must be a fight. There must be a struggle. And the question now is, how do we engage in that fight, and how do we engage in that struggle? And I'm going to edit much of what I was going to say, because I know we have to be out of here by, what, 9:15 at the very latest. So I want to make sure I get out as much as I can. And the other thing is this. When I said I didn't come here to lecture, I mean that. I'm going to throw some stuff out, and then I hope that we can have a dialogue, and you throw some stuff back, and, you know, we'll see what happens as a result. So anyway, what do I do now as this kid in law school who's beginning to get some consciousness, who got some really good advice from a professor about staying into law school, passing the bar, and using the system the way it needs to be used? And let me just tell you about one case before I jump into the whole racism thing and the activist movement. Simply by me taking his advice and becoming a lawyer, back on October 1st, 1998, in North Philly, 12th and Lehigh, a young black kid, 19-year-old Dante Dawson, in North Philly, where I was born and raised. By the way, I was born and raised in North Philadelphia, 20th and York, to a single parent. So when I come and talk to folks like you, I want you to know that I'm not from some Ivy League family, anybody, I don't know if anybody here is from Gladwin or anything like that, but if you are, I didn't come from there. I'm in the hood in North Philly and was able to kind of navigate my way through the system to get where I am now. That's why I'm always humbled when I talk to folks like you, because, I mean, I don't really know much more than you do. I went through the same thing that much of you went through. So anyway, North Philly, I was born and raised, single parent, 20th of York. Not far from there, near 12th and Lehigh, October 1, 1998, Donta Dawson, 19-year-old African-American kid, is behind the wheel of a car, but he stops in the middle of 12th Street between Glenwood and Lehigh and just sits there in a catatonic state. And he stopped there, and two cops, a black cop and a white cop, are in the police car, and they drive by about 3 or 4 car lengths, and they see the car still sitting there, so they stop. The white cop is the driver. The black cop is the passenger. He gets out of the car, unholsters his gun, walks up to the car where Donta Dawson is, tries to engage him in conversation. Donta Dawson is high off angel dust, so he's not responding to anything, like a zombie just sitting there. So the black cop who approached him puts the gun back in his holster and tries to engage him. No conversation. The black cop goes back. The black cop is now talking to the white cop. 2-3 minutes, black cop comes back again with his gun out, walks up to Donta Dawson, still no response, puts the gun in his holster. Now the black cop reaches across the steering wheel, turns off the ignition, pulls the key out, and as he's walking back to the police car, the white cop is now straddled across the hood of the police car and fires 2 shots into the windshield where Donta Dawson is sitting. The first shot misses him, second shot goes into his right eye and comes out of his left ear, killing him instantly. It's a very long and convoluted story, but I want to cut to the chase. So the DA was Lynn Abraham back then, and she refused to file any charges against this cop, Christopher D. Pasquale, who was notorious for an unreasonable belief in the need for self-defense. That you're having an argument with somebody, and you claim they reached into their pocket, and you thought it was a gun, so you fire. But it has to be reasonable. If the person has on short pants and a t-shirt and you can see they have no weapon, it's not a legitimate argument. And finally, there's involuntary manslaughter. That simply means like driving recklessly, speeding, not paying attention, kid comes out off the sidewalk, you hit and kill the kid. Those 5 types. So Lynn Abraham decided that she wasn't going to charge the cop with first-degree murder, which she could have, because first-degree murder means, the legal term is an intentional killing. And intentional simply means, and believe me, I'm going to get to the point in like 30 seconds. Intentional means willful, deliberate, and premeditated. In other words, you think about it before you do it. And she made the argument, the DA did, that the cops really didn't have time to think about it, so it's not first-degree murder. Then she went down to second degree and said, well, there was no robbery, no rape, no kidnapping, no second-degree murder. Third-degree murder, she said that the cop apparently wasn't really trying to, and I don't know how she figured this out, but he really wasn't trying to hurt the guy bad. And even if he was trying to hurt the guy bad for third degree, we go now to manslaughter. It can't be involuntary because that's an accidental, unintentional. She went to voluntary. She basically said that the cop had an unreasonable belief in the need for self-defense. But I got to tell you, there's so many black guys in prison, Latino guys in prison, and poor white guys in prison serving life sentences for first-degree murder for doing the very same thing that she charged this cop with voluntary manslaughter. And by the way, voluntary manslaughter is a 5 to 10-year jail sentence, which means you can be out in 2 years. Make a long story short, she did it because the fix was in. And by that I mean, clearly, what that cop did, the factual allegations legally don't rise to voluntary manslaughter. It's just because that's got to be a reasonable belief in the need for self-defense. But in this case, that didn't happen. If the black cop approached Donta Dawson twice, felt safe enough to put his gun back in his holster, why is the cop 3 car lengths away firing into the car? So she filed the wrong charges on purpose. Why? So that the lawyers for the FOP could make the argument and the judge was compelled to throw the case out. So what did I do? By me listening to what my professor in law school told me to do, I filed something called a private criminal complaint. A private criminal complaint is basically a law that allows private citizens to file criminal charges by bypassing the police and going straight into court, or bypassing the prosecution and going straight into court. In other words, the private citizen becomes a prosecutor. So I'm looking at the law, and I knew the law was designed for nuisance cases. For example, a kid next door keeps playing with the ball. You think the ball's going to break your window. You call the cops. They say, sir, that's a minor thing. We got more serious stuff. Go downtown and file a private criminal complaint. And technically, that's what the law was designed for. But in the same way the system uses the law in a convoluted way for evil reasons, I'm trying to now use the law in a quote-unquote convoluted way, but legal way, because I see we're being recorded here. But it was a legal way of using the law. And I'm thinking, okay, if it says you can bypass the police and go to court, you can bypass the DA and go to court and take your own case, whether it's a criminal mischief from breaking the window or a murder. So Very long story, very short. I filed this private criminal complaint. And on April 6, year 2000, to my astonishment, a judge granted my private criminal complaint on murder, not manslaughter. What did that mean? That means for the first time in Philadelphia history, for the first time in Pennsylvania history, and as far as we know, for the first time in American history, a white on-duty cop was charged with the murder of a black person. Not manslaughter, not aggravated assault, but murder. Hold off on your applause because the ending is not a happy one. What happens now is the DA becomes Johnny Cochran. What do I mean by that? The DA, who's supposed to be prosecuting people, appeals the case. Appeals the case to ask the Superior Court to reverse the victory that we got in common pleas court. The case went up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The DA got so scared they went out and hired Dick Sprague. Dick Sprague is God among lawyers in Pennsylvania, in the United States. So the DA of Abraham hired Dick Sprague, and we went back and forth. We won at one point, lost, went back and forth. Finally, the Superior Court reversed our victory and stated that not so much that we couldn't file the private criminal complaint, but that we didn't have the right people to file the complaint. The people we had didn't have standing. All that means is, and I said, well, Judge, we can't use Dante Dawson because he's dead. He's the one to have the perfect standing. I said, the other thing is this. In a criminal case, it's not Joe versus Mary. It's the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Joe. So you don't need to have standing. Crimes are not crimes against the victim. If I shoot Joe, I didn't violate Joe's law. I violated Pennsylvania law because Joe could forgive me. What if he's my friend? We have an argument at a bar. I shoot him in the leg today. Tomorrow he says, okay, Mike, I understand. I'm sorry. Well, that doesn't mean the DA is not going to prosecute me simply because Joe has forgiven me. So you don't need standing. Why am I telling you all of this? I'm telling you all this because the system, as corrupt and as evil and as bigoted and as racist and as classist as it is, the system can be used to defeat itself, either by a direct victory by getting a guilty or not guilty, or an indirect victory by exposing the system for what it is. I know we're running out of time, so I want to spend 2 or 3 minutes more before I hear your questions and comments about jumping into Occupy Philly and the Occupy movement generally. From my standpoint, and I'm looking at all of the activist movements since the 50s and 60s, whether it's the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panther Party, the Weather Underground, I mean, all of these different movements, and I'm looking at them, and there's some great movements, progressive movements, revolutionary movements, and I'm comparing Occupy to all those. And for me personally, the Civil Rights Movement, obviously one of my personal favorites because it made it possible for me to get into college and to law school and that kind of stuff. But if you ask me what is the most, or has been the most potentially powerful, progressive, cross-cultural movement in the past 50, 60, 75 years, I have to say the Occupy movement. Because it did everything. It's basically about ending economic and social inequality. And when you talk about ending economic and social inequality, you're talking about fighting racism, sexism, and every other ism, because that's all part of it. But then there was a problem, and the problem is that every time you turned the TV on, it was white college-age students out there protesting and demonstrating. And I do a radio show here in Philadelphia, WRD, the only black-owned and operated station in Pennsylvania. And when I would talk about the Occupy movement, the listening audience, they really weren't feeling it. They figured it was some white college kids who had nothing to do, nothing better to do, and they could afford it, because they're like, how are these people living outside City Hall, or living on Wall Street? Don't they have to pay rent? Don't they need to pay the electric bill? I mean, what's going on there? So there was that division, and I think many black folks felt that this was almost a game for many in the Occupy movement. It was simply something to do until you got a job, or until you got a mortgage, or until you got a car note, or until you got married. But looking at what the Occupy movement is all about, once again for me, it's potentially the greatest progressive movement in the past 75 years, maybe even more, because it included everything. And the problem I saw is that there weren't enough black people involved. But I didn't blame white people for that. When I was in law school back in the 80s, I went to Ohio State University, which was and still is the largest university in the country, and back then it had 68,000 students, maybe even in the world. And we were pushing for divestment. That's when the anti-apartheid movement was really hot. And we were trying to get Ohio State to divest all of its funds from corporations doing business with the racist South African government. And at that time, I was the president of the Black Law Students Association. So we would have all these demonstrations and sit-ins, but it might be 3 or 4 black students and about 300 or 400 white students. And I couldn't blame the white students for doing the right thing, and I was wondering why the black students weren't. Totally unrelated issue, and Natalie was one of my students. I actually teach a hip-hop course. And it was almost the same kind of thing. The thing that got me to teach hip-hop is that each time I would go to the Electric Factory or TLA and I'd see Talib Kweli or Mos Def or The Roots or Common, it would be me and Public Enemy as the only black people in the venue. Everybody else was white. But if we went to see Puffy or Yin Yang or some bullshit, it'd be all these black people there for that nonsense and very few white people. So I'm like, why is it that the white folks seem to be enlightened about real hip hop and black folks seem to be completely indifferent about it? And then I take that this Occupy thing. Why is it that it seems that the white progressives and activists are out there doing it and the blacks are not? And I think the answer is this, and I say I think because I don't know. Obviously black people on the bottom end of the totem pole on everything. Home ownership, education, income, employment. We're at the bottom of everything. So it's almost like a race, like running a race. And you got white folks, say, about to cross the finish line, Asians behind them, Latinos, Jews, whatever. All these different ethnic groups about to cross the finish line, and black folks way at the back. And black folks figure it like this. And by the way, I am authorized by every black person to speak on their behalf, so that's why I'm doing that right now.
Documentation.
But having said that, so black people feel like we're so far in the back, we can't do the things that the whites are doing, that the Asians are doing, that the Jewish folks are doing, that the Latino folks are doing. We're so far at the back, we're trying to get up a little closer and a little closer, so we can't engage in all this ideological demonstration and theoretical protest. We got to pay rent, we got to pay the mortgage, we got to do this. The pressure day to day, the shit that black people go through is so intense and so overwhelming and so oppressive, we don't have the luxury to come down to Dilworth Plaza and engage in some ideological discussion about the economic system here in America. Because it's like our house is on fire right now. We got to put this fire out right now. And I think that's the feeling of many black folks. But even though that is the feeling of many black folks, I think to a certain extent it's misguided. Because the only way that we were able to advance the way we were in the civil rights movement is help from other ethnic groups. I mean, that's always going to be the case. It's never going to be one single ethnic group by itself that's going to bring about change, especially if that ethnic group is the quote-unquote minority, the numerical minority. So it needs progressive whites and Latinos and Asians and Jewish folks and everybody else. So, by the way, I told Natalie that this is just going to be the first of a number of times I want to come here again, not to lecture, but to spend time dialoguing. I want to throw this stuff out there and give you all the chance to say, Mike, I agree with you 100%, or nah, that's bullshit. I think that, we need to go another way. But it's all about having the discussion, about having the dialogue, and not so much a discussion dialogue in order to reach a conclusion, but simply have this discussion for the sake of the discussion. Everybody should have the opportunity to say whatever they want. And anytime somebody tries to shut you down, that means that their position is weak. And you've hit a nerve. And now they can't go any further. That's why, with all due respect to religion, I respect all the religions, the known, very well-known, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and the little known. But the problem I have with religion is that it purports to have the ultimate truth. So at a certain point, it says this thing, and whatever this thing is, whether it's the 10 Commandments, whether it comes out of the Quran, the Talmud, whatever, once it gets to that point, there can be no further discussion. And that's a problem, because it cuts off any additional discussion. But the final thing I'll say before I hear any of your discussion, and we got about, maybe 8 or 9 minutes left, before I hear comments from you is, one of the things I think needs to happen is that movements like the Occupy movement, they need to have, and again, I'm saying this today, but if you see me tomorrow, I'm going to say the exact opposite, because this is how I feel right now. In American society, there's a strong opposition to quotas and set-asides and that kind of thing. But I think in progressive movements, there should be quotas and there should be set-asides. There should be a certain number of women who are spokespersons, a certain number of Latinos who are involved out front, a certain number of black folks. It should like be a rainbow coalition on everything. You should, it should be, this spot has to be for a handicapped person. This spot has to be for a Jewish person. This spot has to be for a black person, a lesbian, whatever the case might be, because that's the only way you're going to have everybody's position thought of. It's no fault of white men in America, but white men in America, they run things. And they just have this benefit that white women don't have, black men don't have, black women don't have, but white men tend to get the best of society. So now they got access to the education, to the income, to the political business. They got all of the stuff, and every now and then you get some progressive and enlightened and conscious white men who shouldn't be penalized for being white men. I just happen to be white men. John Brown, my favorite white man, was a white man. So, and the worst person in the world, Satan, is Clarence Thomas, and he's a black man. So it's not always about race, it's about consciousness. So having said that, I'd like to hear from you all for the next 3, 4, 5 minutes.
I just want to completely 100% disagree with what you said about the idea of I'm actually being told to be louder. That's actually quite funny. So I disagree completely with the idea that there should be quotas, that we should have seats set aside for women or for Latinos or for blacks or for Jews or for anybody. I completely think that is the wrong way to go, because then what you're doing is you're basically putting in tokens. You're basically saying, hey, there's a black person here, and there's a woman here, and there's a Latino here. That's bullshit. That's not actually being progressive. That's kind of gerrymandering your representation. I don't think that actually is helpful to actually move forward. It might aesthetically look nice and pretty, but I don't think it's functional or practical in a movement like this.
2 quick responses. One, I think I'm right. That's the first response. But the second response is you might be right. That's why when I say that, if you see me tomorrow, I might say the exact opposite. I know that now in America, white Christian men tend to run everything. So I'm trying to figure out what we can do to shake that up. So I guess I'm going from one extreme to the next. And I jokingly said I think I'm right, but I concede that you might be right. This is the kind of thing we need to talk about. And I might tomorrow say, yeah, I think that was kind of, misguided, my thinking. But right now I'm looking at what we do have in society, and I know for a fact that doesn't work. So I'm thinking, okay, what's the exact opposite of that? But maybe I'm going too far. I don't know. But it's something to talk about. So you might be right.
Over here we got Whitney, and then over
Yeah, just 2 quick comments. The first one, I agree with you about having a quota system to make sure that diverse perspectives are in a movement that claims to be for the 99%. I absolutely think that's a great idea, and your activism and your experience, I think, lends to the wisdom behind what you're saying. So the second thing I wanted to say is that I also agree with what you said about black folks needing to be proactive, because one thing I find frustrating is that sometimes things happen during meetings, and then you hear about it, and then like the next day all of a sudden we have all these black folks coming in raising hell about what happened. But my question is, why weren't we already in the meeting?
Yes. When
the stuff goes down? You need to be here when we're not talking about race. You need to be here when we're not talking about the hood per se, to keep the perspective in it. And if you're not here, you only have yourself to blame. If you think the process is disenfranchising, come here often enough, sit down and look at what you think is wrong, analyze it, and contribute what you think should be the right thing. It's not enough just to come in here and start complaining all the time. You have to put some gas on the fire. Otherwise, we would still be on the plantations in Virginia, in South Carolina, whatever, if we didn't have that mentality. So I personally am sick of it, of the blame game. If you don't like it, come in here and be the change that you want to be. Otherwise, stay home. And don't be surprised if people that don't look like you aren't here. That's all. Thank you for coming.
I think that's an excellent point. I think one of the problems with activist black folks is that many of us tend to focus on only our issue and forget about the issue of the disabled, the issue of gays and lesbians, the issue of women. So I think if we expect a quote-unquote white movement to listen to us and help us, we ought to listen to them and help them. It's about coalition building.
Lisa?
I think everything you said I disagree with, and I think it's bullshit. No, I'm kidding.
I got nervous.
But I think the word quota sometimes would get
It shook people up, yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. But I do agree with the idea of getting different perspectives, obviously.
Okay.
I think that one of our problems has been, I mean, Whitney was speaking to different sets of people, different communities, white, black, everything that kind of float in and out. And I'm kind of interested in also hearing what you think in terms of your listeners on the radio program. So far, in terms of outreach, just brainstorming, our most successful, I would argue, has been changing the abandoned lots into gardens and stuff like that. But it does often require us to go into communities of color and poor communities, and a lot of us are white. And sometimes, I do think that's positive because it's an action rather than just us having a discussion in here. But I think that one of the things that we miss out internally and externally is even though we're coming in kind of innocently to like fix up a garden or whatever, we do a lot of either demonstrating or talking and not too much listening. And I think that people in those communities know those communities best. I think that's the reason that I would argue for a quota, is that like a lesbian or a Jewish person or black or Latino know their situation the best. And a lot of times our ideas are great, but they're coming from our perspective. And just being on the left side of left for a good deal of my life, which is, I'm still young, but still, there's a lot of talk, a lot of promises, a lot of bullshit. And I think that we ought to start listening to each other just as much as we talk.
Absolutely.
So that was
I mean, you make such a good point, and compelling point based on what you said and what she said. I think I'm backing off my quota state. You know, I really think so. I mean, I thought I was 100% completely right about that, and I heard her point, and I hear your point. I'm like, maybe that was bullshit. Let me think about it. I don't think it was total bullshit, maybe partially, but not totally. But yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we all agree in the concept that something has to be done, where folks whose voice has not been heard is somehow heard. If you want to call that a quota, sensitivity, whatever you call it, we just need to hear from more than just Christian white men.
I want to thank you for coming out tonight. We can't hear any more questions. We're at our time. I would ask that everybody quickly make their way out so that we don't infringe on the Friends Center. And if we have any more questions, maybe we can handle them outside on a more personal basis.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
What's your name?
I'm Jackson.
All right, nice to meet you.